Hey everyone, welcome to my second video on the new R5 Mark II, and today's video is going to be a setup guide for professional wildlife photographers to get the most out of this camera. We're going to set up triple back button focus, we're going to set a speed boost button, and we're going to make sure everything is dialed in to really get the most out of this new R5 Mark II. I'm going to show you what you need to set out of this camera in order to get the most out of it for wildlife photography. So with that, let's get into the menu system. I'm going to skip a lot of things in this menu because this camera comes largely set up how you want it, but we're going to make sure that everything is set up for you. So what we're going to do here is this by default is going to be set on JPEG quality. If you want to get the most out of this camera, you want to make sure you're shooting in RAW. You could shoot in C-RAW or regular RAW. RAW is going to take up a little bit more space and also fill your buffer faster. C-RAW really doesn't have a huge difference in image quality, but if you're worried about that at all, it's maybe worth just shooting RAW. For now, I'm just going to leave it in RAW. Skipping over to page 6 now. We're going to go to drive mode here. By default, this is going to be on high-speed continuous plus. We want to set this actually to high-speed continuous, and then we're going to customize what each of these things mean. Right now, I think by default, the camera has the regular high-speed continuous set to be 10 frames per second. H plus is 30 frames per second. And then low speed continuous, I believe, is set for 5 frames per second. We're going to customize all of those. What I'm going to tell you how to do is we're going to set a button to speed boost the camera from high speed continuous, which I'm going to set to 15 frames per second, which is going to be kind of a standard fast speed. But then when action is happening really quickly, I'm going to be able to just press a button on the front of the camera here and turn it into the 30 frames per second just for a quick boost. So for now, we're just going to set this high-speed continuous where it is here. The next thing to look at here, make sure that your silent shutter function is turned off. I actually don't want to have a silent shutter. I want the electronic shutter to be set to have a little bit of sound associated with it. And you'll see kind of how we can dial in that sound to make it so basically I'm the only one that's hearing it. That's going to give me just that audio feedback to help me know when the camera is shooting images, but it's not going to be something that's going to be loud enough to disturb wildlife like that mechanical shutter is. So we're just going to leave silent shutter off and we'll dial that in another menu. Shutter mode here, I have in a later setting here set to blackout free shooting, so that's why this is grayed out. But if you wanted to choose mechanical shutter, that would be where you would choose that. Mechanical shutter might be useful for landscape photography because you get ever so slightly higher dynamic range with that, but it's a pretty small difference. So I'm just going to stick to electronic shutter for now. Release shutter without card. By default, this is actually on, so you'll want to make sure to turn that off so that you're not taking pictures without recording them. As we flip through, we don't need anything in these next menus. On page 8, you're going to want blackout free display turned on. For wildlife photography, that's just going to let you have an uninterrupted view of your subject, which is important if you're tracking a fast-moving subject and you don't want to have that blackout. That's one of the great things about a mirrorless camera is in the old DSLR days, we always had the mirror in front. And so a lot of us are used to having that blackout, but it is something that's really nice to be without now that we can do without it. So I'm going to turn that on. And then Auto power off on page 9, I'm just going to turn that on to high so that the camera doesn't overheat as quickly. So this is going to basically increase the temperature in which the camera tells itself to shut down when it gets hot. So let's move on now to the AF menu. What we're going to do here is we're going to put this on servo. Because we're going to set up back button focusing, we want that to be on servo all the time. AF area, we're going to turn this on to spot. You'll see here that there's actually spot with no tracking. That's what that little symbol is there. We want the spot with tracking selected here because we're actually going to turn that off elsewhere, but having the spot with tracking is going to allow us, when we're using eye-controlled autofocus, to select a subject rather than just pinpointing. Because the eye control autofocus is sometimes a little bit less precise than actually using the joystick when you're using spot focusing. So what we're going to do is have that to be selecting subjects rather than selecting an individual point. So we're just going to keep this on spot AF right now. And whole area tracking servo AF, you'll want to make sure this is on. You'll see that's that little weird symbol again. Next menu here, subject to detect, we want that to be set to animals. And then eye detection auto is going to make sure that we have basically the closest eye to the camera being prioritized. You could select right eye or left eye here if you know that you're always going to want the right or left eye. With wildlife photography, my guess is you just want this on auto. And then register people priority, we're going to turn that off because we're photographing animals. This is where you have autofocus cases. So we're now in page 3 of 7. This is the autofocus cases. We can dial this in to our personal preferences and based on the subjects that we're shooting. This is something that I'm probably going to play with depending on my subject and sort of how the autofocus is behaving. For now, I'm probably going to leave this on auto, but you can go into manual here and you can manually set how often you want the camera to jump off of subjects and how fast you want it to accelerate and decelerate with your subject. So we'll just keep this on auto for now, and I think that will probably be a pretty good setting for the time being. In this next menu, I'm going to turn AF assist beam firing to off. And that's just going to make sure that we don't have a light coming on the camera. This is something I run into sometimes when I'm doing night photography, like photographing aurora or Milky Way or something like that. And a light turns on the camera when I'm trying to do like autofocus at night, and I just don't want that. So we're going to turn that off. And then we're going to ignore everything in page 5 of 7. 6 of 7, and 7 of 7. So we're all done with that AF menu now. We're going to basically also ignore everything in this blue menu for now. If you want to, you can turn on highlight alert here in page 4 of 4. So that's just going to alert you if you're overexposed. But other than that, I don't think there's anything you need to worry about in this menu. In these network settings, I don't like to have my camera connected to Bluetooth or creating a Wi-Fi network to connect to my phone or anything like that. I find it drains battery and I just don't want to deal with it. So I'm going to disable that, which by default, that's going to be enabled. So you'll want to make sure to turn that off. And then Bluetooth settings, I'm also going to disable here, which are also by default on. So turn both of those off. And then just move over here to this yellow wrench menu. In this menu, this is going to be where you're able to format a memory card. And then auto rotate here, I'm going to turn this to just on the computer. If you have it on the camera and the computer, what it's going to do is it's going to rotate the images on the back screen. And so vertical images are going to show up really small rather than taking up the whole screen. I'd rather turn the camera to look at those vertical images. So we'll just stick with auto rotate on the computer. Now we'll move over to the next menu here. If you haven't set your date and time, you'll want to do that here. And beep, this is kind of counterintuitive, but you need beep to be enabled. When I first went through this menu, I disabled it, and you can see this volume tab is no longer available. So we have to have beep enabled, which I normally don't like to have, but we can dial that in the volume settings. So this is where we can set the volume of our shutter. So you can see, you can play around with how loud you want the camera's sound that it makes for the electronic shutter to actually be. By default, it's at 2. I'm going to turn this to 1 so that it's really quiet and basically only I'm hearing it. Focus beep, I never want that. You can hear that's what that's going to sound like. That's usually only in one-shot focus that it's going to make that kind of sound, but I just don't want that sound ever, so I'm going to turn that off. Touch sounds, don't want that. Self-timer volume, I'm probably going to turn that also to 0. That's just going to be like the countdown that the camera gives you if you set it to like a 2-second timer or a 10-second timer. Usually when I'm doing that, it's because I'm doing some kind of a long exposure and I just don't want that sound. And then beep per video taken, I don't want that sound either. So essentially the only sound that we have on here is our shutter, and we're just gonna have a very minimal sound for that. Now moving on here, you can dial in the brightness settings that you want, but I'm not gonna worry about that. Power saving, this is gonna be where you're gonna want to dial in when you want the camera to shut down or not. I personally don't want the camera to shut down while I'm recording this video, but I normally will have some kind of shutdown settings dialed in there. I just have everything disabled so that it doesn't stop recording this menu right now. So dial that in basically to your personal preferences. And then also shutter at shutdown. I want to make sure that that's closed. That's just going to keep us from getting dust in the sensor when we're changing lenses out in nature. And then that is it with this menu. So we're then going to go over to the green menu. This green menu is going to be the most important menu for setting up this camera because this is where we're going to dial in our custom buttons. So if you skipped over that last part, this is where you're going to want to pick back up again. And this is a really important part of the process. So we're going to customize buttons for shooting. I'm going to have this shutter button set over to metering start. This by default is going to be set to this first one here with eye control. We're going to dial eye control into a specific button. So I'm just going to leave this on metering start. And this is going to allow us to do that triple back button focus. So let's go in and set those 3 back buttons. So the first one we're going to do here is the AF on button, which is on the back of the camera next to your joystick. This here, we're going to set that to metering and AF start, which is where it is by default. But we want to make a change here because if you remember back in the beginning of the video, if we set that spot focus to have tracking on it, we're going to need to dial this in here. So we're going to hit info and it's going to give us this menu system here. And what we're going to want to do is do whole area tracking servo AF. We're going to check that, but we're going to make sure that that's actually turned to off over in this sidebar here. And then we'll do spot detection on here. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow us to set an individual spot that's not going to move around the frame or try and select something that the camera is detecting. Something that you'll find in wildlife photography, for example, I was photographing bison last night, and sometimes the camera finds the bison and it will just draw a box around the whole bison, but I want to make sure that the camera is getting focus on the bison's face. And so if the animal eye detection or subject detection isn't narrowing in enough, I can use the spot focus to make sure that it's getting the kind of precision that I want. And I don't want, when I'm doing that, to have that box then expand out, which would happen if we have that tracking turned on. As long as what we want in focus is behind that point that we select, it's going to be focusing in that spot. Now, that is everything we need to do for that one. And then we're going to set animal eye detection for the star button. So we're going to go back here to this star button. This is the AE lock button, and we're going to turn that over to animal eye detection. So we're just going to put that on eye detection AF, and because in that previous AF menu, because we set that up for animal autofocus, that's what type of eye it's going to try and detect here. The triple back button autofocus, which I never did on the original R5, is because we now have the eye-controlled autofocus in this R5 Mark II, and I'm going to set that for this third button here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over to the moving AF point, start AF by eye control, and we're just going to turn that on there. Now, sometimes, so if you have that set, the eye control is always going to be active. Sometimes it can be a little bit distracting to have that eye control circle going around your frame. So if you want to turn that on and off, it might be useful to set another button on the camera to do that. And so what I'm going to do for that is I never really use the top button here that illuminates the display. So I'm going to set that button to turn the eye control on and off. So we'll go over here. We'll go up in this menu actually. It's just going to be this one here. And I'm going to go over to eye control and turn that on. Now, the last button that we're going to want to customize that's going to be super important and super useful for wildlife photography is that speed boost button that I was talking about, where we can go from a lower frame rate to a high frame rate without having to go through the settings. So what we're going to do is I'm going to set that to a button on the front of the camera. So this is the depth of field preview button. You'll see on the front of the camera, there's a little circle button, and we're going to go into this menu here, and we're going to go down to the bottom here. And then we'll do switch electronic shutter continuous shooting modes. And then we'll hit info here and we'll select high speed continuous plus. So what that means is whenever that button is pressed down, it will turn the camera into that higher frames per second. So it's not going to stay after you let go of the button. It's only going to speed boost when you're holding the button down. The next thing that we're going to do to make sure that this speed boost function works is we're going to make sure we dial in what the speed of those high speed continuous modes are. So we're going to go back to the menu system here, and we're going to go over to this orange menu, and then we're going to go over to continuous shooting speed here. This is going to be page 3 of 4, and we're going to click on that. Here, high speed continuous plus is set to 30 frames per second. I'm going to set high speed to 15 if that's not already set. And then low speed, I'm actually going to put that up to 10. We don't have a button for low speed. I'm rarely probably going to go to that, but we're just going to keep this like that. Now we're all good, and we'll be able to use that speed boost button just how I demonstrated. The last thing that we'll want to do is make sure we calibrate our eye selection here. So that's going to be also in this new green menu. So we're going to go to eye control, and we're going to turn eye control on, and then we can calibrate it here. So you'll choose your calibration, and do lots of calibrations and refinements in order to get this working the best for your eyes. It doesn't always work perfectly, but I am finding that it works really well enough. And what we have set up now, you'll essentially be able to look from one subject to another, and then it will track that subject. It's good to be able to select individual subjects with your eye. And it will also, if it doesn't find a subject, it will default to moving your autofocus point around, just like with the joystick. So that is everything we need in the photo modes. The last thing that I'm going to do as a hybrid shooter is make sure that I have my record button set so that I can quickly shoot. In my case, I'd like to be able to shoot 4K 120 frames per second slow motion video of wildlife really quickly. So what we're going to do in order to do that is we're going to flip this switch on the top of the camera over to video mode. Okay, so over in our video mode, now what we're going to do is select this movie recording size. I'm going to go over to 4KU, and then I'm going to go over to 120 frames per second. Now that we have 120 frames per second done, we're going to go down into recording format, and I'm going to choose 4:2 10-bit. So this is going to give us a little bit higher quality. And then everything is good in this side of the menu, but we'll want to go over to custom picture, and I'm going to choose on and then C2. What that's going to do is that's going to give us C-Log2 recording, which is going to be something that we can then grade, and it's going to be great for dynamic range and give us a really, really great image quality that we can then work with for wildlife video. The Atomos won't let me record this, but then I'm just going to dial in 1/250th of a second in my exposure controls here. And a wide open aperture with auto ISO. And those are going to be kind of a good baseline setting. In order to get this so that it's then saved into that record button, what we're going to need to do is go back into the menu system. And once we're in the menu system, we can go over to this yellow menu, and it's going to be page 5 of 6, custom shooting C1 through C3, register settings, and we're going to do custom shooting mode C3, and we're just going to hit OK. And then auto update set, we're going to hit to enable, just so that it keeps whatever settings we last had when we were in that mode. So now, when we're in photo mode, we can just press that red record button at the top of the camera and be shooting in 4K 120 to get that nice slow motion video of wildlife that we can then use later on. So with that, this camera should be pretty well set up for wildlife photography, and I don't think you should really have to do too much more after that. Play around with the camera, see whether you like different things or not, but this is going to be how I'm going to use this camera. Just as a quick plug, I lead workshops here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, as well as up in Katmai in Alaska. I have 2 Katmai workshops in 2025, as well as a winter snow coach tour in Yellowstone. Those are going to be really special trips. And then I also do private workshops in the Tetons in Yellowstone. So if you're interested in that, head over to PangaeaExpeditions.com. And with that, I will see you in the next video.